The last video that I did kind of explained
This is the
how to...
1,400 hours a
Whoops.
year you waste on your phone. With Purdue Global, you can turn that time into
The last video that I did kind of talked about how to live it, like, normal life. The first few of them dealt with kind of extremes, but I never did get to the full process of how we get here, where we are, and where we're going. So where we came from, we start with, the reason that I start with God and not nothing is because in order for nothing to be, there has to be being. And in order for nothing to happen, there has to be a happening. And so we can't really just only start with nothing. There has to be something that's beyond that. And every single time that we talk about nothing, we're trying to discern it. Every time we try to discern it, we have to discern it against something that it isn't. And so we get causal dynamism. And I realize that that's only a constraint, again, like the Planck length of our discernibility. It isn't a constraint on what reality really is. But as an idealist, because I feel like that's what reality is, then I accept that that's what reality actually is. Because intuitively, that's the way it strikes me. But someone else could be a rationalist or an empiricist or something like that, and they would take a different view. So I start with God, not nothing, because I can't see of how anything else could exist without there being a God. You always end up running into this problem where it's like, in order for there to be nothing, there has to be being. There has to be a be in order for there to be nothing. So you can't even have nothing without there being being. And then where did being and nothing come from? You could start with causal dynamism. So you could say that nothing is created by being and indiscernibility. And indiscernibility is created by being and nothing. And being is created by nothing and indiscernibility. That they all create each other, causally, dynamically. Being, nothing, and indiscernibility all create each other. And you could just stop it there, but then how did that start? Where did this causal dynamism come from? And so the question ultimately always ends up being, where did the fundamental come from? And then you either assume it into being by axiomatically saying there cannot be a case in which this fundamental doesn't exist, or you have to revert to God and say that it must have been some external being that chose to create it that way. Now, every single time that I have looked at whether it's nothing or being or indiscernibility or an absolute or some fundamental like space or time, anything that I've considered to be the origin, where you can't have anything without it, every time I've done that, I've run into the same limit of discernibility. I can only say it up to the limit of discernibility. I can say, there can't be anything that's smaller than a Planck length that I can discern. There can't be anything that doesn't extend into space that I can discern. There can't be anything that doesn't extend into time and occupy some length of time that I can discern. But always only that I can discern, not that there is in and of itself, but only that I can discern. And so for me, because I always have to see that limit at the end of it and say that the limit that I'm approaching here is not a limit of existence, it's a limit of my ability to discern existence. So given that limit, given the fact that I can't ever break through that limit because I can't comprehend anything without comprehending it, I can't measure anything without measuring it. I can't discern anything without discerning it. Well, then I can't know what it would exist before that, what would exist before causal dynamism. I can't know what would exist before that. It's a pointless question. Just like anyone else's axioms, that they assume into being, where they cannot comprehend reality without this thing being true. If they can't form an opinion or a discernment where they can tell one thing from another without reverting to this particular pet axiom or assumption that they bring in, then what else? What is there? Then what you could do is you could define that limit itself and say it's limited. There are other alternatives to just that. It can't be the case that fundamental must be the only fundamental. So let's say space. Let's say Bob cannot comprehend anything that doesn't exist, that doesn't occupy some space. And then you tell Bob, okay, what about numbers? Numbers themselves don't occupy any physical space. And then he could be like, well, numbers do occupy theoretical space, as in terms of geometrical proximity along the number line, telling you that 1 is 1 unit away from 0, and 2 is 2 units away from 0. And so there's still a space there. It might not be physically demonstrated, but it is a space. To Bob, that's enough. He can still have his axiom of space as being the most fundamental and say, well, okay, numbers can be real because they have some space to them. The number 1 doesn't occupy the same space as the number 2. There is a measurable, distinct space in between the number 1 and the number 2, and between all the other numbers. And then you can say, okay, so now that we've drawn the distinction between physical and abstract space, and you're content with it being abstract, it doesn't have to be physical, then what about time? Does time necessarily extend into space? And then Bob would argue, yes, of course it must. The only thing that has time would be something that would exist in space. And then I would say, okay, Bob, can you imagine a time in which there was no space? Such as, for example, before the Big Bang, or before you were born. There was a time, but there was no space. Or you could say, after the death of all things, where time, being a measure of change, doesn't really exist anymore because there's no more changes. And space is a measure of distinction, and there's nothing that's in existence because there's no more distinction. And yet that still exists, and that's still something that has what you might call a time or a sequence or an order, because it is after the heat death of existence. And so you keep approaching that, you keep confronting the limits of what Bob's or whoever's axiom is, and you treat the axiom as the fulcrum, and you go just one step beyond that, and you find something that must be the case, but yet must also be beyond that axiom, and you will always find something. But the problem is, it doesn't necessitate that the person believes that that's either true or necessarily beyond the limit. They may absorb it, like I was showing with numbers. Maybe Bob started out with being a materialist who thought that everything had to have material physical space first, but then after being introduced to the concept of numbers, then Bob switches and says, no, it only has to be an abstract space. So he absorbs the abstract difference between one number and another through abstract space by expanding his definition of space to include abstract space as well as physical space. And then you keep confronting that limit, and one of two things will happen. Either they will expand and absorb the thing that you're trying to describe within their limits by expanding their limits further, or they'll have to secede and say, no, you know what, I was wrong and I have to now choose some other referent. If you examine any axiom, any referent, anything, if you examine it long enough, you'll find that it becomes absurd. It becomes this weird paradox. It becomes this strange thing. If you look at anything too much, it starts to unfold. It starts to unravel. It starts to become bizarre. And you can either accept that it's bizarre and say, well, it's only bizarre in that context, or it's only bizarre if I look at it like that, or it's only bizarre if I think about it too much, or look at it too often, or use it too much. But for the most part, it works fine. You can either do that, or you can say that everything is absurd and become nihilist and be like, no, there are no valid assertions, because all these assertions are pointless, meaningless arbitrations that come from nowhere, that mean nothing, that don't have any justification, ultimately, and they all contradict each other. So what is the point of absorbing all of this stuff into our limits and expanding our limits over and over and over again until we finally encapsulate everything that we can finally comprehend, only to find that there's still something beyond that that invalidates everything that we already believed? It's kind of like with science. Like, people say this a lot. Well, science always changes. Science used to say this and science used to say that, and now it says all this other stuff. And so science is bullshit. Well, it isn't that it's bullshit. It's just getting better at telling the truth more accurately, more reliably. So we may start out with some basic assumptions, like things get tired and that's why they stop moving. That's what Aristotle thought. And now we know, no, it's because there's kinetic energy that gets put into a mass to make it move, and then that friction between the mass and whatever it's interacting with, the medium through which it's moving, produces a necessary friction which slows it down, because it interacts with that mass, and mass is resistance to change, so it resists continuing to move, and it eventually, that resistance compounds and compounds until it stops. So, we refine these things over time. It's not that it's always wrong, it's that it's approximating perfection. So it builds closer to it, gets sharper as it goes along. Now, what happens when we look at where we came from is we have to go back to those assumptions, because wherever we came from, we only can answer that question by making an assumption because of the limit of discernibility. I can only tell you where everything originated from that is discernible, but as soon as I try to cross that line, I can't tell you anything else after that point. So I get that same confrontation. Do I expand my limit and say, well, I'm going to absorb all the things that I can't discern anymore and believe that those are fundamentally true also, which I don't do. I could do that, though. I could say that everything is ultimately ineffable. But if I feel like if I chose to do that, when I try to put that helmet on my head, it's so heavy that I can't walk anywhere. What's the point of living if I can't describe it to someone else, if I can't measure it, if everything that I feel like is just some arbitrary, random ass meaningless reaction that I can't measure and that I can't discern, well, then there's not really any difference between me and anyone else, and there's not really any difference between one state of being and any other state of being, and that just doesn't make sense to me because I can tell the difference between feeling like shit and feeling good. If I can tell the difference between those two things, then there must be some discernibility to reality, at which point I can't absorb all of those things that I'll never be able to discern into reality. I have to leave them at the door and say, no, those are not part of reality. Reality only goes as far as discernibility, and anything beyond that isn't actually real. And so then, where did we come from, keeping that in mind? If I were to think about indiscernibility, because I keep striving toward discernibility, so then the origin of discernibility must then be indiscernibility, because it has to come from somewhere. So it had to come from something that wasn't it, and what isn't it is indiscernibility, and so then discernibility comes from indiscernibility, and truth comes from falsehood and all that stuff. Now, when we go to that limit where we say there's a limit of all the things that I can discern, and beyond that limit there's only indiscernible things, and when we reach that point, we say that those things don't exist or are not real, then what I'm saying is that in order for something to be real, it has to be discernible, and it has to abide by the measures of reality. That's one of the measures, is discernibility. It has to be independent, it has to be consistent, which is what makes it discernible, and it has to be sustainably interactive, which is also what makes it discernible. And the fact that it's independent makes it discernible. It's distinct. There's something about it that is not the same as everything else. And that's what makes it independent, and that's what makes it discernible, and that's what makes it real. Again, like I had said, that is an axiom, and that is arbitrarily chosen by me because I feel like that's the better choice, but it isn't justified in any other way. It's only justified by my subjective state being better when I approach existence assuming that that's true, versus approaching existence assuming that it is not true. And that's why I'm an idealist, is because that's how I ultimately make that decision. I make it because that's what feels best to me. And it's a pretty strong feeling, and so I can be pretty convinced of it. But that doesn't make it absolutely true. It just means that it fits me. And so when I say that things that are not discernible are not real, it's because of the measure that I'm using to define what is real as being discernible. And I only choose that definition because it subjectively feels better when I make that choice to view reality as being that which is discernible than the subjective feeling that I have when I don't make that decision. So when we talk about where we came from, I have to realize that I've made this assumption that reality is always discernible, and that therefore if reality came from somewhere that wasn't itself, then that thing must have been indiscernible as a derivative of an assumption that I arbitrarily made. So I can't say that that's necessarily true, but if my axioms are true, then it must be the case that where we came from was indiscernible. We cannot discern where we came from necessarily beyond the limit of discernibility. We can only assume the discernibility limit and then derive everything else after that, after we've already established all the prerequisites to something being discernible from something else. So then necessarily where we came from was that which makes things discernible from each other, which is a causally dynamic interplay between two distinct things, and they're distinct because they can't both be true at the same place at the same time. And there's three of those. There's three absolutes that cannot be reduced, and they can't tolerate each other's existence within each other. So there is no being in existence. There is no existence in being, in nothing. There is no indiscernibility in nothing. There is no indiscernibility in being. None of them can be inside of the others, and they all create each other. And the reason that I can have confidence in justifying that is because of my assumption of discernibility, that things can be made and must be made distinct from each other. And I find that distinction in the nature of nothing. You can't have being in nothing. Nothing is nothing. You can't have anything in there. You can't have indiscernibility in there. And yet, nothing itself is indiscernible. I can't discern nothing because there's nothing there to discern. But yet, there's also not indiscernibility in the nothing. It's on it at its skin periphery surface, but not in it at its central core. And so, while nothing is indiscernible, it is not indiscernibility itself, because it's nothing. And indiscernibility is not nothing, it's indiscernibility. It's an absence of discernibility. It's like a fog. And that's not the same thing as just vacuous space. Fog isn't vacuous space, and vacuous space isn't a fog. Although you could say that space is kind of foggy, you can't say that it is itself a fog, because you can't see it. You know, in the same way that you can't, like fog obscures your vision. And space does obscure your vision, because there's a limit to how, first of all, how far light can travel given particular speeds relative to each other. And there's a difference between the dimness of the light that gets received at a certain location given the space between it and something else. And that's why objects that are further at a distance are going to be dimmer than objects that are closer that are of the same illumination. So space does obscure vision, so we could say that it's foggy, but it is not itself fog. So in the same way, space is indiscernible, but it is not itself indiscernibility. And so there's this marked distinction between those two things. And it is there regardless of whether I'm there to discern that distinction or not. They simply are not the same thing. Irregardless of who it is that's looking at them, irregardless of anything else, they can't be the same thing. Nothing cannot be indiscernibility, and indiscernibility cannot be nothing. And likewise for being. So those are the three absolutes. So they're distinct because of their natures of not being able to tolerate the others in its presence. So you can't put being in the presence of nothing without there being some weird contradiction. You can have causally dynamic limits between nothing and being and indiscernibility, but you can't say one of them becomes the other one. You can say they share the same limits, but you can't say that they are all the same thing. In the same way that my lungs share the same limits as my blood vessels, but that doesn't mean that my blood vessels are my lungs. It just means that they share the same limits. Just like the air shares the same limits as my skin, but that doesn't make the air my skin. So, and that's true whether or not I'm looking at the air or looking at my skin, or whether I'm discerning them. They are discernible. I can discern the difference between my skin and the air, irregardless of whether I'm actively participating in that discernment or not. They're still discernible. So that discernibility reaching so far as to include the three absolutes from which everything else can be derived means that everything must have a discernible distinction between them. And so where we came from is that distinction is causal dynamism, the interplay or limit between nothing and being and indiscernibility, which helps us define and discern what they are, or at least what their limits are. We may not be able to discern what they actually are at the core of their selves, but we can discern what their limits are. And that's important when we try to discern an absolute, because an absolute, being absolute, is larger than any measure that we use to measure it. So there's not really a way of juxtaposing an absolute with anything else because it's absolute. And so there has to be a discernible distinction between three absolutes in order for it to make sense, in order for there to be those limits, and yet there is still that absolute. You measure the limits of one absolute with the limits of another absolute, rather than trying to measure what the absolute core is. You just measure its limits at the periphery, at the extreme, at the very edge of what it is. So where we came from is the edges between nothing being and indiscernibility, which is causally dynamic or causal dynamism. And where did that come from is indiscernible, because we have now, once we reach causal dynamism, reduced everything into a singularity, because there's the same causal dynamism between nothing and being as there is between nothing and indiscernibility, as there is between any of the absolutes, as there is between any two things that we can possibly imagine putting together. There's always the same causal dynamism. So we have no longer any room to discern one thing from another, because everything ultimately is causally dynamic. It's a causally dynamic interplay between parts of that total causally dynamic system. So you could think of everything in existence as occupying some particular specific area of a giant hurricane or tornado or whirlpool, which is causally dynamic. There's an interplay between one part of that whirlpool and another part of that whirlpool that makes the total whirlpool spinning around. And where that comes from is necessarily beyond our ability to discern, because we've moved past absolutes and now there's no more room for measurement. The causal dynamism itself becomes absolute, and it's an absolute between all absolutes, making it the ultimate absolute that we can discern. Beyond that, I believe, because I believe in feelings, because I believe in the power of my subjectivity, I believe that there is a subject who created that causal dynamism. But rationally, I have to stop at causal dynamism and say, I don't know, and I will never know, and I cannot discern what could exist beyond that causally dynamic interplay between the three absolutes of absolute nothing, absolute being, and absolute indiscernibility. There's no way of pushing past that and yet still being able to discern anything. That's the absolute background of all the absolutes, and you can't get more absolute than that. So I can't discern rationally what's beyond causal dynamism, but I believe that God exists beyond that, because I believe in the power of our choices. And if I didn't believe in my own subjective feelings or the power of choices, and I rationally just stopped at causal dynamism and said that that's just the origin of everything as it is, and that's always been there and always will be there, and there's nothing not even nothing beyond that, and said that there was no God, then I wouldn't have any place to justify my value of subjective feelings, because those would just be arbitrary, meaningless, happenstance, coincidence, rather than it being something that's fundamental and has some direct relationship with some subject that is beyond myself. And so I personally choose to invoke a God in order to continue to justify my subjective feelings and say that there's something that's beyond those feelings that generates it, and the reason that those feelings emerge is because it's an affirmation of the relation between my subject and God's subject, and the causally dynamic interplay between my subject and God's subject is that feeling that I get. And that's how I personally integrate all that stuff into one theory. So the emotions that we feel, the very thing that I choose as my ultimate axiom is my feeling, and I choose that one and justify its value as being true as the interplay between my subject and God's subject. Now, you could say that it's just an interplay between my subject and some other subject, but if I do that, then what's the difference between my feeling and their feeling? What's the difference between one feeling and another feeling? What's the difference between any of those things? Ultimately ends up being relativistic, and it doesn't ever reduce to one final answer. So if it doesn't ever reduce to one final answer, and it's all relativistic, then I don't really have any way of determining the value of one feeling over another. They're just some relativistic feeling that I happen to coincidentally have because of some interplay between my subject and some other subject. But if I invoke God, then I can say that there is a value to that feeling because it's divine in some sense. There's a definite substantive reality to it because of it borrowing its divinity from God. And then I can place full faith in it, and that makes me feel good, and so it affirms itself, and I continue. But notice how feeling-oriented that is. And it really doesn't matter. The reason that I hold that so tightly is because it doesn't even matter if you use rationalism or relativism or any of the other alternatives that I've ever said. There will always be a feeling associated with it, and that feeling is the only real justification behind why someone chose that axiom to believe rather than some other axiom, is because of the way it makes them feel. Now, maybe the reason that they feel better or worse is because of something else, but it's still a feeling, and so I always go back to feelings as my ultimate standard. Now, I use discernibility and logical validity and deductive reasoning and stuff like that, of course, because I believe that everything is discernible, just like the interplay between my subject and God's subject. There is a discernible interplay between them, and I don't think that it can be just thrown away as some vague amorphism. There's a substantive, concrete value to that particular interplay versus some other alternative interplay. If there weren't, then we wouldn't be able to discern one feeling from another. So the reason that there is discernibility between feelings is because discernibility is part of feeling. It's part of everything, and everything is discernible. Now, like I said, that doesn't mean that it's discerned, it just means it's discernible. And it doesn't mean that it's discernible to us, it just means it's discernible to God, or to some being that is necessarily beyond the limits of all imperfection and finitude. But it is discernible, and that requires faith, but it's well rewarded because it's affirmed throughout everything in existence that there is a discernible, actual distinction between one thing and another, and that distinction is there because ultimately of God, and that there is a divine reason for it, and that it has divine value. I can just as easily choose not to believe that, but I don't have any way of justifying it when I don't. There's nowhere else to go. If there's no God, there's nowhere else to go. There's just what I already hold in my hand, and I can't go before that and describe how it ended up in my hand. It just is there. So I get the present, but I don't get the past, and arguably I can't really even get the future without that assumption of God. So that's what I do. But it isn't necessary, it's just what I do. And so where we came from is from God, creating causal dynamism between the three absolutes, and that interplay, that causally dynamic interplay between being and nothing and indiscernibility, causes everything that we see in reality to exist. And so where we are is an objective arrangement of how much nothing and being and indiscernibility there is in any given location, and what that location is relative to some other location, which then builds a total system arrangement. So you've got the subjective baseline of what everything is a position, a location, a subject relative to God. And then there's the relations between all those positions and each other. And there's also the relation between those positions and God. And then there's the final total system arrangement of all the relations considered simultaneously at once in one giant arena. And that arena is the physical reality that we see around us. The theoretical framework and laws that govern all that stuff are all the individual specific relations, either between an individual object and God, resulting in a physical law like gravity, which affects all things, or it's a specific relation between two specific things. For example, the number 1 and the number 2, and they have that specific distance between 0. So it just depends on whether the relation is something that can be reduced or if it's something that's universal and general, and it doesn't, and the objects and subjects in it can be interchanged. If they can be interchanged, it's a law. If it's a law, it's a relationship to God. If it's specific and if you were to swap out one object for another, and that totally changes things, that's specific, and that has to do with relativism. How one object relates individually to another object, or one subject to another subject. And that's within the realm of discernible relativism. And that's why we can discern specific things, and we can discern universal things, but we can't discern every single universal thing. We'll never have a complete list of all objective laws. And we'll never know exactly where every particle or being is. We'll be able to know where some of them are, but we won't be able to know where all of them are. We'll be able to know some of the stuff, but we won't be able to know all of the stuff. And so that's what relativity is, and that limit is there because we don't have access to beyond reality in order to see the totality of reality, in order to see that final total system arrangement. The best that we can do on the inside is to approximate, and this is where we're going, we approximate that larger image, that total image of reality, by building larger and larger and larger models that have more and more and more stuff in them, while still maintaining consistency and integration. As long as we can build a system that's big enough where none of the pieces contradict each other, then we can have a really sharp image of what it is that is going on here. And the image gets sharper and sharper and sharper as our resolution increases and our reference frame increases, we get a sharper image and we get a better precision about what is actually happening. But where we're going, we don't have the ability to ever become God, so we'll never know absolutely everything, but we will get more and more and more information, and we will get better and better and better and better approximations of all of the information that we do have. Because of the discernibility between things. So given the fact that something can be discerned from something else, means that there's something inside those things that make them distinct, means that there's an independence in there, which means that they're not interchangeable. And that's the discernible limit of what it is to be a subject, is that it is not interchangeable. Whatever my subject is, it can't be interchanged with yours. Whatever your subject is, it can't be interchanged with mine. I can't just be you, and you can't just be me, and no one will ever become some other person. So we're all distinct in that way. We have that independence. And so we have our subjectivity. And so that is necessarily beyond the limit of relativity, which means we won't ever really know what that is, even in the future. But it will be more and more closely approximated as we find out more information about ourselves and each other. As we find out more information about ourselves, we find out more information about each other through relativism. And as we find out more information about each other, we find out more information about ourselves, again through relativism. And that's where we're going. We're constantly building through specifying relations between people because we don't have a total objective viewpoint. We only have relativistic viewpoints. The good thing is that we can all approach the same relation, and we can, even though we're approaching it from different angles, we all can at least discern the same relation between things. So we can integrate our own viewpoint with someone else's and come to the same conclusion that they came to. And so both of our systems, albeit distinct, are still coming to the same conclusions, and at least their conclusions are interchangeable, even though the people that are making them are not. And that's where we're going. That's where we're headed. That's the purpose of all being, is so that we can integrate with each other and create a larger approximation of the total system arrangement.